All right, my gay lovers, gather round, because today you're going to hear my story about how my twin brother and I were caught in the middle of the most insane situation. This is the craziest story you could ever hear, so sit back and listen to the end. It's worth it. It all happened with Ronald when we turned 18. At that time, I was a closeted gay guy, and honestly, I didn't tell a soul. It wasn't even something I was ready to admit to myself fully, let alone share with anyone. The only person I really had in my life was Ronald, my twin brother. He was the kind of guy who always had girls around him, muscular, smart, charismatic in a way I never quite was. I mean, I wasn't bad either, but standing next to him, it always felt like he had that extra spark. Despite the fact we were like two peas in a pod, I'd always admired him, probably way more than I should have. When I finally realized I was into guys, it hit me like a truck that I was in love with Ronald. Not just in love. I wanted him every single day. I'd daydream about him, picture how things could be in those quiet moments when I was alone. Imagining him was the only thing that felt right. I'd think about how it would feel if he took me, if we shared that kind of closeness. Every time I pleasured myself, he was the one I saw in my mind, right there with me. That night, everything changed. It was just the two of us at home. Our parents and my sister, Dala, remember that name, she's going to be important later, were off on vacation. Ronald and I had the house to ourselves. We were hanging out in the living room, doing what we always did, playing video games, watching movies, and cracking jokes. We had a few beers, not enough to get totally wasted, but enough to feel that warm buzz. We were sitting on the couch, close but not touching. He was laughing at something stupid I said, and I couldn't help but just stare at him. I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of pull towards someone, but it's like every little thing they do just hits you differently. The way he threw his head back when he laughed, the curve of his jaw, the way his shirt stretched over his shoulders. I wanted him so bad it almost hurt, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't ruin what we had. We were practically brothers, and I'd rather suffer in silence than lose that connection. Still, my mind wouldn't stop. I kept imagining what it would be like to kiss him, to explore him. My thoughts were racing. I pictured running my hands over his chest, feeling the strength beneath his skin. I wondered what his lips would taste like, what his scent would be up close, right against my face. I'd fantasized about it 1,000,000 times, but having him right there, so close, it was almost too much. I tried to shake it off, focus on the movie, but every little movement he made was a distraction. He stretched his arms, and I caught a glimpse of skin under his shirt. He shifted closer to grab the remote, and our legs brushed. Just that tiny bit of contact sent a jolt through me. I was on edge, every nerve in my body tuned to him. Eventually, we both got tired and decided to crash in my room. We had 2 beds in there, pushed up against opposite walls. It was a familiar setup. We'd had countless sleepovers over the years, always in those same spots. Nothing had ever happened before, and I kept telling myself nothing would happen now. I had to keep it together. We turned off the lights and lay there in the dark, just talking. His voice was low and relaxed, and I hung on every word. We joked around for a bit, and then things got quiet. I listened to his breathing, steady and slow, and wondered if he had any idea what he did to me. I knew he didn't, and part of me was grateful for that. The other part ached for him to know, to see me. I so wanted to get up and approach him. This was my chance, but he's my brother. I couldn't just go, and you understand. Eventually, we both drifted off, but that night wasn't over, not even close. So, like I said, we fell asleep. Or at least I did. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it must have been late. The room was dark except for this faint glow coming from Ronald's side of the room. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust my eyes, and then I realized what I was seeing. Ronald was awake, lying on his bed, his phone in his hand. At first I thought maybe he was just scrolling through social media or texting someone, but then I heard sounds. It took me a second to register it, but yeah, it was that kind of video, and he wasn't just watching. I could see the way the blanket moved, the way his hand was under the covers, and it hit me like a punch to the gut. My heart started pounding. I didn't know what to do. Should I pretend I was still asleep? Should I say something? I was frozen, just staring at him, my mind racing a mile a minute. I'd fantasized about this moment so many times, but now that it was actually happening, I was paralyzed. And then, before I even realized what I was doing, I got up. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound. My feet barely made a noise on the floor as I crossed the room. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the beer. Maybe it was the months of bottled-up feelings. Or maybe it was just the raw, undeniable need I felt in that moment. But I crept over to his bed, reached out, and grabbed his arm gently. He jumped a little, his eyes wide, like he'd been caught doing something wrong. I could see the surprise on his face, the way his cheeks flushed in the dim light. We stared at each other for a second, neither of us saying a word. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, I said, Do you want some help?" I expected him to push me away. I thought he'd laugh it off or get angry, tell me I'd crossed a line. But he didn't. His eyes searched mine, and there was this flicker of something. Curiosity, maybe? Or maybe he was just too drunk to process what was happening. Either way, he didn't stop me. I slipped under the covers with him, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. The air was thick with tension, this electric charge between us. I reached out, my hand shaking a little, and touched him. He was, well, let's just say he was bigger than I expected, way bigger than mine, despite the fact we were both almost similar. And the look on his face, it wasn't just surprise anymore. It was something else. I could see the way his breathing changed, the way his body tensed and relaxed at the same time. It was like he couldn't believe what was happening, and honestly, neither could I. I focused on him, on the way he felt, the way he responded. His deep breaths filled the room, and it was like the world outside didn't exist anymore. It was just us, in this bubble of heat and tension and something I couldn't quite put into words. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A sound. It was quiet, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. Footsteps. A door. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I was so caught up in what I was doing, in him, that I pushed it out of my mind. If only I'd paid attention. So, picture this. Ronald's lying there, his eyes half closed, completely lost in the moment. I'm right there with him, doing what I'm doing. And then the door opens. I froze. Time seemed to slow down. I turned my head, and there she was, Dala, our sister. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hallway light. At first she didn't say anything. She just stared. And then, in this half-laugh, half-scream, she said, "What the hell?" I wanted to disappear. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me whole. Ronald scrambled to cover himself, and I just sat there, frozen. Dala's eyes were wide, and she was laughing this weird, hysterical laugh, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "You two? Seriously? This is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life." It turns out she'd decided to come home early from the trip. She'd gotten to the station with my parents, but at the last minute, she changed her mind and caught a bus back home. She'd been planning to surprise us, and, well, she succeeded. I couldn't say anything. My mind was blank. Ronald was trying to explain, stammering out half-sentences that didn't make any sense. Dala just kept laughing, shaking her head like she couldn't process it. And then she left, still laughing, as she closed the door behind her. After Dala left, the room was dead silent. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. It was like the air had been sucked out, leaving only the weight of what had just happened hanging between us. My heart was still pounding. but now for an entirely different reason. The rush, the heat, it had all vanished the moment she opened that door, replaced by a flood of panic, embarrassment, and something else I couldn't quite name. I glanced over at Ronald. He was staring at the ceiling, his face flushed, his breathing uneven. It wasn't just from what we'd been doing. It was from being caught by her. It was one thing to have this secret desire, something I'd buried deep for so long, but to have it exposed in the most intimate moment, and to Dala of all people, it was too much. I didn't even know how to process it. My mind was spinning, jumping from one thought to the next. What would she think? What would she say? Was she going to tell someone? The idea of anyone else finding out made my stomach twist. I'd spent so long hiding this part of myself, building walls around it, and in one moment, those walls had been torn down. Eventually, I rolled over, turning my back to him. I couldn't face him, couldn't face the reality of what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, shame, confusion. But underneath it all, there was still that undeniable pull. Even now, even after everything, I still wanted him. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but sleep didn't come. Not that night. After everything that happened, the next morning was incredibly awkward. I woke up early, long before the sun had even started to rise. The night felt like it had lasted forever, and now, in the quiet of the early morning, everything felt more real. My mind raced, replaying the events over and over, the things we had done, the way I felt, the way things had shifted between us. It was all still so fresh, hard to grasp. The weight of what had happened last night pressed heavily on me. It wasn't just the physical connection we'd shared, but the emotional layers that had come with it. I'd been feeling something for so long, and now it was out in the open, more real than ever. But now there was a different kind of uncertainty settling in. What did it mean? What did this mean for us? Could we go back to how things were before? Or was this a permanent shift in our brotherhood? Ronald stood next to me. His movements were slow, like he was also gathering himself. I could sense he was feeling the shift just like I was. We didn't speak immediately, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to start. But then he turned to face me, his expression different from usual. It was still Ronald, the same guy I'd known for so long, but there was something new in his eyes, something softer, almost unsure, and yet there was this undeniable curiosity there too. Finally, he spoke, breaking the silence. He spoke quietly last night, his tone subdued, as if he were measuring each word with great care. I hadn't anticipated it to unfold like this. I mean, I've been intimate with women before, many times, but what happened last night with you was different. It possessed a sense of authenticity and felt right, even though I hadn't planned for it. The intensity caught me off guard. I could sense the sincerity in his voice, and it struck a chord within me. A part of me had been apprehensive, wondering if he would become withdrawn or awkward after everything, but his words revealed that much of this was uncharted territory for him too. A part of him was venturing into realms he hadn't fully explored before. "I never thought I'd feel this way," he continued, a brief pause punctuating his words. "It felt natural, even though it shouldn't have, right? But with you, it just clicked. I guess I wasn't expecting that." His candor took me by surprise. There was no hesitation in his voice now, just a peculiar blend of inquisitiveness and something else, something I couldn't quite articulate. The vulnerability between us was palpable, and I knew this was a watershed moment for both of us. A surge of emotions washed over me. A part of me had worried that this would alter everything, that it might somehow tarnish the bond we shared. But hearing him speak like this made me realize that perhaps it didn't have to be a negative thing. We were both uncovering facets of ourselves that we hadn't fully grasped before, and it was all part of our shared journey. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew neither of us could fully process everything immediately, but there was this newfound level of understanding between us. We were both trying to decipher what this meant, what we meant to each other, and what lay ahead. It wasn't merely the physical connection we'd experienced. It was the trust, the honesty, the vulnerability. It was the way we'd lowered our defenses and seen each other in a way we hadn't before, and that was something I hadn't anticipated, but something that felt significant, important. I inched closer, unsure if he would retreat, but he didn't. Instead, he adjusted his position slightly, moving towards me. Words seemed superfluous. It felt like we were both allowing things to unfold naturally, without overanalyzing. I gently extended my hand and touched his arm, simply letting it rest there. His skin was warm beneath my fingertips, and I could feel his muscles gradually relax as he inhaled deeply. I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, but it felt instinctive. I leaned in slightly and placed a tender kiss on his forehead, a soft, lingering gesture to reassure him of my presence. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt meaningful. He reciprocated without a moment's hesitation. We drew nearer, our bodies now mere inches apart. I kissed him again, this time on the lips. It was a slow, unhurried kiss, the kind where words are unnecessary, but both parties understand the unspoken desires. His lips were warm, and I could sense him relaxing further. There was no pressure, no expectation to do anything or go anywhere. It was simply about being present with each other, cherishing the closeness. I kissed his neck, gently at first, then a little lower as I felt him shift. He didn't pull away. In fact, he let out a soft sigh, and I could sense his body responding, moving subtly beneath mine. It felt as though we were in perfect sync, both navigating this new terrain together. I didn't care if Dara walked back in. My thoughts were solely focused on being here with him, immersed in the present moment. I wasn't in any rush. I didn't feel the need to hasten through anything or complete what we had initiated the previous night. It wasn't about that. It was about being close to him, feeling his warmth, listening to his steady breaths. As things advanced, I found myself taking the initiative, my movements cautious, almost tentative, yet growing more assured with each passing moment. Ronald responded to every gesture, his body tensing and releasing in a rhythm that mirrored my own. His breathing grew deeper, more ragged and uneven, and from the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of him. His face flushed, his head reclined against the pillow, his eyes tightly closed as if he were caught between disbelief and surrender. It was like witnessing a side of him I had never encountered before, a raw and vulnerable part that he wasn't accustomed to revealing. His hands found their way to my hair, threading through it, not pulling but resting there as if he needed an anchor. There was something surreal about the moment, not in a fantastical sense, but in the way it felt like gazing into a mirror. His reactions, his movements, even the way he seemed to hold back, reminded me of myself. It was peculiar, yet strangely comforting, like discovering a reflection of my own emotions and energy within him. Time seemed to lose all meaning, stretched thin in the haze of intimacy and connection. It could have been minutes or longer. I honestly couldn't discern. All I knew was the sound of his breathing, the weight of his hands, and the way we seemed to move in unison, as if we had done this countless times before, even though it was still uncharted territory for both of us. Then, a noise, faint but distinct, registered in my awareness. My heart skipped a beat as I froze momentarily, straining to listen. The hallway outside was now bustling with activity, footsteps and a muffled voice calling out. My mind acknowledged the sound, but it didn't fully detach me from the present moment. The door was closed this time, thankfully, providing a thin barrier against the intrusion of the outside world. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though we were suspended in our own private bubble, detached from everything else. The knocking commenced, a firm, rhythmic sound that pierced through the stillness. It was Dara. Her voice resonated clearly through the door, teasing us in her typically audacious manner. I cast a glance at Ronald, whose complexion deepened to a more intense shade of red. His grip in my hair tightened momentarily, and I observed his struggle to maintain a steady breath, striving to suppress any sound. Yet his physique betrayed him. Each slight jerk, each subtle vibration revealed all I needed to know. He exerted great effort to remain composed, and witnessing this was both touching and exhilarating. I didn't halt. I was unable to. The pressing nature of the situation, our defiance of external distractions, intensified everything. Dara continued her knocking, her tone escalating with impatience, but her words hardly penetrated my consciousness. They faded into mere background noise, insignificant compared to the bond we were forging. He strained to keep silent, biting his lip and breathing shallowly, yet his state of heightened arousal was evident. Meanwhile, Dara persisted in her knocking, interjecting with biting remarks through the door, likely aware of the unfolding events. After several more attempts, she cursed and stormed off, her footsteps receding down the hall. A brief sense of relief washed over me, knowing we were once again alone, but it mattered little. In that instant, nothing beyond the confines of the room held any significance. My attention was solely on him, on us. Each motion, each look, each inhalation felt like an unspoken dialogue, a language unique to us. It wasn't merely about the physical intimacy. It was the underlying emotional intensity, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was an unforeseen yet mutually desired development. We remained silent, continuing as if the external world ceased to exist. It wasn't hurried or uncomfortable. It felt organic, as though we had experienced this countless times. When it eventually concluded, we lingered, neither of us eager to move. Ronald lay back, breathing heavily, his face still flushed. His eyes remained closed for a while before he finally met my gaze, yet he remained silent. Words were unnecessary. Upon exiting the room, Dara was already seated at the kitchen table, halfway through her morning meal. She didn't look up or acknowledge our presence initially, continuing to eat as though nothing had transpired. But I knew her well. She was biding her time, waiting for the opportune moment to instigate something. After a few moments, she casually inquired about our activities the previous evening, feigning ignorance of her disruptive pounding and yelling. Ronald interjected before she could finish, instructing her to cease her charade since she was clearly aware of what had occurred. This elicited a laugh from her, of course. She leaned back, smirking, and made some snide remarks about us being a great couple. Then she delivered the real blow. Would we be interested in posting videos on a certain website? I wasn't in the mood for her antics. I told her to stop, but she remained undeterred. She simply shrugged, suggesting I shouldn't act so boldly unless I was prepared for her to expose what she had recorded. I momentarily froze, not out of fear, but because I knew something she didn't. Dara believed she held all the cards, but she was unaware that I had been accessing her iCloud for months, and let's just say she had some compromising videos of her own. So, I told her. I delivered it matter-of-factly, without any theatrics. Her face instantly paled, and she appeared utterly flabbergasted. It was the kind of reaction you'd only witness once, as though she couldn't fathom that someone had turned the tables on her. The most amusing part was that she likely thought I was bluffing until I mentioned one particular video. It wasn't just any clip. It was one where she was, let's say, engaging in some very creative activities with her ex-boyfriend, the kind of video you'd want to keep hidden from the world. Her reaction was priceless. She called me a monster and stormed off to her room, playing the victim. Meanwhile, Ronald couldn't contain his laughter. He attempted to, but the absurdity of the situation overwhelmed him. I couldn't help but crack a smile as well. For someone who relished in creating drama, Dara was completely out of her depth when the roles were reversed. The remainder of the morning was surprisingly tranquil. Dara remained in her room, likely sulking or devising some form of retaliation. But I wasn't concerned. She knew better now. Ronald and I proceeded with our day as if nothing had occurred, but every so often he'd shake his head and chuckle to himself, clearly still entertained by the whole affair. I was relaxing in the room, lost in thought. Ronald had stepped out for a while, and I had some time to myself. Honestly, I couldn't stop replaying the recent events in my mind. It felt like things had shifted rapidly between us, but in a way that felt natural. The way he'd been acting around me, the change in the atmosphere when we were together, it was all a bit overwhelming, but in a positive way. When Ronald returned, he initially remained quiet. He carried the scent of his cologne, that fresh aroma, and I couldn't help but notice his relaxed demeanor, which was unusual for him. He had been wearing numerous layers lately, always keeping things concealed, but tonight he seemed more at ease, as though he was shedding whatever he typically kept bottled up. He began to undress, acting nonchalant as if it were inconsequential. I observed him silently. Though I attempted to conceal it, my observation of his actions wasn't difficult. He then announced his intention to shower and inquired if I wished to join him. At that juncture, I was uncertain of my feelings. Ronald wasn't typically one to pose such questions, so it caught me off guard, but I wasn't inclined to refuse. I followed him into the bathroom, a quiet tension suspended between us. It was a seemingly minor event, yet it felt monumental. The water in the shower was warm as we entered. It was one of those instances where it wasn't merely about physical proximity. It felt as though something more significant was unfolding. We stood there, allowing the water to cascade over us, our bodies pressed together. I could sense his physical response, the warmth of his skin against mine. My hands rested on his back, my fingers tracing the contours of his muscles, sensing a tension that hadn't been present earlier. It was uncomplicated, unforced. He wasn't rushing, and neither was I. The water flowed over us as we kissed. It wasn't dramatic, merely slow, yet it felt as though everything was culminating towards something we could no longer disregard. He shifted, drawing me closer, and I felt his hands explore my body. I didn't resist, and neither did he. At one point, he turned me around, his hands gently guiding me to face the wall. I was uncertain of his next move, but it was irrelevant. He leaned in close, his lips brushing against my neck, kissing the back of my head. I could feel his breath on my skin, and for a moment, everything felt aligned, as though we both finally comprehended our current position and trajectory. The night felt altered. The shower had been a simple, casual affair, but as we emerged, wet and dripping, it was evident that the dynamic between us had shifted. The air was cool against our damp skin, the room steamy from the heat, and the floor was soaked from the water. I stood there momentarily, allowing everything to register. Ronald had been so relaxed, so uncharacteristically open. It was as though the physical barrier between us had dissolved. I could hear Dara's boisterous phone conversation in the hallway, but her voice seemed distant, insignificant. Everything felt more subdued now, more tranquil. Ronald had gone to retrieve a towel, and I was still attempting to process the recent events. It wasn't merely the water or the sensation of his body close to mine, it was the entire shift in our dynamic, the unspoken elements that had begun to feel natural. My heart was still racing, but in a different manner. I wasn't anxious any longer. I was simply aware. Everything around me felt vibrant, yet in a serene way. I moved toward the door, acting on impulse, and locked it. That simple action made me feel more grounded, more in command of the situation. Not that I required control. I didn't. It simply felt appropriate, as though I was creating a space for us to be ourselves, free from interruptions. The sounds from the hallway once again receded, and the room became solely ours. Ronald approached me from behind, and without even glancing at him, I knew he was near. I could sense the change in the atmosphere. There was no urgency, merely this subtle attraction between us. He remained silent, simply kissing me. I hadn't anticipated it, but it felt organic. He led, unhurried and assured. It wasn't forceful, but it was as though he was assuming control, guiding me through something we both needed to experience, even if we didn't articulate it. His kiss was gentle, yet it possessed a depth that surprised me. We were still damp from the shower, and the fabric of our clothes clung to our bodies, moist with water. The sensation of our skin against the fabric, feeling it adhere and press together, felt more intimate than it likely should have, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply us, in that instant. Everything felt as though it was progressing gradually, yet purposefully. It wasn't merely about the physical intimacy, it was more than that. It was the manner in which he touched me, the way he moved. He wasn't rushing me, wasn't attempting to move faster than I was prepared for. He seemed equally attuned to the moment as I was. I felt his hands on mine, gently guiding me, drawing me nearer. The way he touched me was unlike anything I had anticipated. It was tender, yet there was a firmness there as well. He wasn't restraining himself, but he wasn't imposing either. It felt harmonious. He kissed my neck, his lips pressing softly against my skin. I was uncertain of what to do, except to allow it to unfold, to permit myself to experience it fully. His kisses weren't merely superficial. They felt as though they were delving deeper, as though he was endeavoring to communicate something non-verbally. After a few more moments, he shifted, turning me around gently. I was uncertain of what to anticipate, but the rustling of clothes behind me revealed all I needed to know. My heart began to race once more, but this time, it wasn't from apprehension. It was from something else. Exhilaration, anticipation, but also trust. I knew Ronald, knew his mannerisms, and I trusted him. Even though we were venturing into uncharted territory, it didn't feel hurried. He wasn't pressuring me. He was simply moving in sync with me, ensuring my comfort. The way he held me, firm yet gentle, made me feel secure. It wasn't the same as before, not merely physical any longer. It felt as though we were exploring something that transcended us, but we were doing it collectively. Initially, it was slightly painful. It was novel for me, something I hadn't encountered previously, but it wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't something I couldn't manage. There was a gentleness in his movements, the way he adjusted himself and ensured my well-being. It was gradual, but not in a manner that caused me discomfort. It was a type of gradualness that felt necessary, as though each motion, each touch, was deliberate and significant. It felt as though he was taking his time to ensure everything was perfect, every movement appearing deliberate, as though he was paying attention to each minuscule detail. It was one of those serene moments where everything else in the world seemed distant. The house felt still, almost suspended in time, as the faint hum of the outside world barely penetrated the walls. The sound of the rain from earlier had diminished, leaving only the occasional rustle of the wind. Inside, the space felt familiar, comfortable. It had become our space in a way, a place where the lines between friendship, family, and something else entirely melded into one unspoken truth. Words were no longer necessary for us to comprehend each other. We understood the rhythm of each other's breath, the way each movement conveyed volumes. That night, it was just the two of us, and despite all that had transpired in the past few months, there was something unspoken between us that felt more like an attraction than ever before. We had been close before, emotionally and physically, but tonight there was a novel energy in the air, a kind of intensity that made every breath, every touch, feel magnified. The instant we were alone, there was no hesitation. It was as though we had both reached this juncture where we no longer needed to question if it was acceptable. It had long since surpassed the point of uncertainty. There were no boundaries left to traverse, no hesitation, only the shared, tacit understanding. We gravitated toward each other almost instinctively, both of us cognizant of the other's needs without a word. He was close, yet not close enough. His hands rested on the sides of my face. his thumb gently tracing the contour of my jaw. There was nothing hurried about it. The touch was unhurried, deliberate, grounding. And even though it had become second nature, this intimacy was still just as potent. Every movement felt laden with significance, as though everything had culminated in this. Each gentle caress of his thumb against my skin sent a tremor through me. There was warmth there, but it wasn't the heat of desire alone. It was the warmth of familiarity, of connection. His face drew nearer, and for a moment, everything decelerated. The room around us seemed to dissipate. The only thing that existed was the sensation of his breath against my skin and the steady, profound throb of my heart. It was as though the world had paused, and we were suspended in that instant. I didn't need to utter a word. I didn't need to question or analyze. I simply relinquished control. The sensation of his lips against mine was something I couldn't articulate. It wasn't urgent. There was no frenetic energy. It was gradual, patient, as though he was committing to memory every inch of me, and I reciprocated. I desired to feel every part of him, his warmth, the pressure of his body against mine, the way our lips melded in perfect synchrony. Every touch was meticulously considered, as though he was relishing the moment, unwilling to rush through any part of it. The kiss intensified, but it never forfeited that tenderness. Each shift of his mouth against mine seemed to convey, "I'm here with you." There was something in the way he moved his hands. His fingers traced the contours of my back, sensing the curve of my spine, the tension in my muscles. He wasn't in a rush. It wasn't about the culmination. It was about experiencing each other, allowing the quiet intimacy of the moment to unfurl. Every inch of contact sent shivers down my spine. His hands, warm and unwavering, explored the familiar territory of my body. There was a tranquil, steady cadence to everything, a flow that felt natural, almost indispensable. I found myself leaning into him, sensing the weight of his body as it settled over mine. The sensation of his chest pressing against mine, the heat of his skin, rendered everything else inconsequential. It was just him and me, in that space, in that instant. His hands migrated to my waist, his fingers gently delving into the fabric of my shirt, tugging it upward. I raised my arms, permitting him to remove it, exposing my skin to the cool air. But it wasn't cold. His body, his warmth, filled the interstice between us. It was like a quiet form of intimacy, one that wasn't about hastening, but about savoring the proximity. His lips descended lower, across my neck, leaving tender, lingering kisses that caused my pulse to quicken. The touch of his lips against my skin felt almost like an inquiry, an invitation to something more profound. His hands discovered their way to my chest, sensing the steady rise and fall of my breath. It was gradual, purposeful. He wasn't merely touching me, he was engaging with me. I could sense it in the way his fingers caressed the curve of my body, in the way his lips lingered on every inch of exposed skin. Each movement was deliberate, meticulous, as though he was ensuring that every part of me comprehended how much he cared, how much this signified. I responded in kind, my hands traversing his skin, sensing the muscle beneath his shirt, his warmth, as though he, too, was dedicated to remembering every part of me. My fingers traced the contours of his chest, the form of his arms, the familiar texture of his body beneath my hands. It was as though we were both exploring each other anew, as though the act itself was a form of revelation. There was no rush, no urgency. Everything about it felt like a gradual burn, something that would never truly be concluded. And then we both shifted, moved in a manner that drew us nearer. His weight pressed me into the mattress, but there was nothing stifling about it. It was the kind of pressure that felt appropriate, that rendered everything more grounded. I could sense his heartbeat, its rhythm, against my chest, synchronizing with my own. The connection between us intensified, but not through any words or actions. It was simply there, this attraction, this undeniable proximity. His lips discovered mine once more, and this time it wasn't merely the tender, lingering kiss we had previously shared. It was more pressing now, yet still gentle. His hands descended lower, his touch exploring further, yet never transgressing a boundary that wasn't welcome. Every movement was met with a gentle resistance, as though to convey, yes, but not yet. We're not there yet. We remained like that for a while, simply exploring, simply experiencing each other without the necessity for words. The intimacy was genuine, grounded in trust and shared experience, but also in the tacit understanding that this was more than physical closeness. It was about something more profound, the kind of connection that doesn't require verbalization, because you can sense it in every breath, every touch, every movement. And just as we had before, we arrived at that juncture where everything decelerated. There was no urgency to progress, no pressure to escalate. We simply lay there, entwined, sensing the rhythm of our bodies, the warmth of our connection, and the understanding that everything we were doing was sufficient. When we eventually separated, it wasn't with disappointment, it wasn't with sorrow, it was with a kind of serene contentment, as though we had both obtained precisely what we required. There were no words between us, no necessity for them. The silence sufficed to communicate everything we couldn't articulate. It had been a moment that was hours and hours alone, something shared profoundly between two individuals who comprehended each other more than anyone else could. That night, everything felt more lucid. It was as though we had resolved an inquiry we hadn't realized needed addressing. We didn't need to proceed any further. We didn't need to pursue anything else. In that moment, in that intimacy, we were precisely where we were intended to be. And though we both knew that life would continue, that things would alter, there would perpetually be that memory. The way our bodies connected, the way the world receded, and we were simply two individuals quietly relishing each other in the most profound, intimate manner conceivable. As he held me close, his hands tracing my back, I could sense his body's response. It wasn't merely physical. It was as though we were both acquiring new knowledge about each other. The way he kissed me again, this time, for the initial few months, it was as though we were in our own secluded sphere. We discovered a rhythm, an unspoken comprehension. Even though Dara was aware of what was transpiring, she remained silent. She didn't need to utter anything. The video she possessed, those moments we shared that felt both intimate and vulnerable, afforded her a degree of leverage. But it wasn't about power for her, it was about the shared understanding among all of us. We didn't converse about it extensively, and she didn't press the issue. She was occupied with her own life, pursuing her own endeavors, and we were simply determining our position amidst it all. Ronald and I continued to meet, as we always had. Initially, it was still about the exhilaration, about exploring each other in ways we hadn't previously. There was something addictive about it, the way we could transition from jesting to touching, to making each other feel sensations we hadn't experienced with anyone else. And yet, as the weeks metamorphosed into months, something shifted. It wasn't the same any longer. The effortless intimacy we shared began to feel more burdensome. It wasn't merely about the physical gratification any longer. Something more profound had commenced to bikash lab kra, this unspoken yearning for something additional. But there was perpetually this tension, this intangible demarcation that neither of us could traverse. We were siblings, fraternal twins, and that unspoken impediment was insurmountable to disregard. Each time we drew too close, the actuality of our relationship, the verity that we shared the same blood, the same lineage, rendered it unfeasible to completely succumb to what was burgeoning between us. The emotional intricacy, the guilt, the necessity for something disparate, all collided in those quiet moments where we both discerned that perhaps what we possessed wasn't tenable. So, after a few months of relishing the closeness, the intimacy, the remarkable sexual encounters, we arrived at a juncture where we knew we had to make a determination. We couldn't persist in this manner. We necessitated something else, something authentic, not merely a connection predicated on physical allure, but something more profound, more enduring. And that was the most arduous part to acknowledge to ourselves, for the verity was, we both still desired each other, but we also knew we couldn't persist in transgressing those boundaries. The dynamic, the relationship, it wasn't salubrious for either of us in the long term. We discussed it one tranquil night. We sat together after everything had receded, and I could discern the same notion flickering in his eyes. We were both fatigued from evading it. We required space to mature, to ascertain who we were beyond the bond we had forged. It was the most arduous resolution, but we concurred it was time to terminate what we had. For now. We both knew that perhaps, just perhaps, we could pretend to each other someday, but it wasn't the appropriate time. Not then. And so, we determined to depart, not from each other entirely, but from the kind of connection we had cultivated. It wasn't the conclusion of us, but it was a modification in how we perceived each other. Ronald commenced courting someone earnestly. His girlfriend was everything he had required in a companion, someone who elicited the finest in him, who comprehended him in ways I couldn't, and I couldn't. I observed as it all unfolded, stood by his side as he discovered his joy, even though a part of me felt a pang of something more profound, something I had to suppress and relinquish. As for myself, I remained unattached. It wasn't intentional. It just occurred that way. I believe I required a period to sort things through, to be alone and comprehend why I'd been entangled in something so intricate, so multifaceted. I needed to learn how to be independent before I could commit to another, and that was a concept I didn't fully grasp until I distanced myself. For a time, things were uneasy. There was this newfound space between us, a boundary we could no longer traverse. But we still encountered each other, Ronald and I. We shared serene instances, but they were altered. There was no more extended contact, no dynamic spark. We behaved as if nothing had transpired, as if we were merely two guys who had always been close, because in some respects, we still were. Yet the history we shared lingered between us, unspoken, and that made it more challenging. In certain ways, it was as if we were both feigning contentment with what we had left behind, but internally, we both recognized it had been both exquisite and trying. It was peculiar, though, how effortless it became to act as if nothing had ever occurred. We went through the motions, socializing, enjoying ourselves, being present for each other, but the closeness, the bond, was absent. It was as if we had erased the past, even though we both understood it would never truly be that straightforward. But the reality was, it had been magnificent, despite all its intricacies, despite all the disorder. What we had shared was something I wouldn't exchange for anything. It had been genuine. And at times, I would find myself reflecting on those days, the sensations, the way we connected on so many levels. I wouldn't have relinquished that, even though it couldn't endure. And now, months later, I see him with his girlfriend, and I'm sincerely pleased for him. He's discovered someone who brings him joy, who shares his life in a manner I never could. As for myself, I'm still navigating my path. I no longer touch him, not in that manner. We've both progressed in our individual ways, but there's still a fragment of me that carries that link with me, even if we don't discuss it. Perhaps someday we'll reunite, but for now, this is our present. And you know what? It was magnificent. The instances we shared, the way we explored each other and ourselves, will always remain a part of me. I'll reflect on it with fondness, not remorse.